Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back through the soft candlelight of royal courts, to visit some of Europe's most unfortunate family trees. So, if you're already tucked in, lights low, maybe a faint hum of rain outside, perfect. We're about to spend the next hour and a half exploring centuries of powdered wigs, hereditary jawlines, and the slow, inevitable consequences of marrying your cousin. You see, royal families once believed that bloodlines were sacred. Sacred, and not to be mixed with commoners, peasants, or anyone who hadn't already appeared at least twice in their own family Bible. So, they married cousins, nieces, uncles, and sometimes their own nieces' cousins, who were also their nephews. It all got quite complicated. And by complicated, I mean catastrophically genetic. Tonight, we'll drift slowly through the dim corridors of Europe's palaces. From Madrid to Vienna, from Paris to Prague. Meeting the pale, jittery products of centuries of noble inbreeding. The Habsburgs, the Bourbons, and a few others whose family portraits look like they were painted during a mild earthquake. So, take a breath, sink into your pillow, and let's start where most genetic tragedies do, in Spain. The Habsburgs, Europe's favorite genetic experiment. Our story begins with the Habsburg dynasty, a family that, for centuries, treated the European gene pool like a walled garden. They ruled much of Europe, owned entire empires, and apparently decided that the best way to preserve their royal purity was by marrying as close to home as possible. Very close. The Habsburg family motto could have been, "Why meet new people when you can just marry the ones you already know?" At first, it worked out well enough. They were rich, powerful, and perpetually overdressed. But after about 200 years of cousin marriages, the royal portraits started to look symmetrical in all the wrong ways. Let's meet one of their crowning genetic achievements, quite literally, Charles II of Spain. Charles II of Spain, the tragic end of the Habsburg line. Charles II was born in 1661, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. And from the moment he arrived, everyone knew something was wrong. He was a king by blood, but his blood had been overused. Imagine centuries of uncles marrying nieces, cousins marrying cousins, and every genetic coin toss coming up tails. By the time Charles was born, his family tree looked less like a tree and more like a wreath. He had what's now known as the Habsburg jaw, a chin so pronounced it could have been used as a coat hook. His tongue was too large for his mouth, making speech difficult. He struggled to chew, which seems cruel for a family known for their banquets. He was sickly, frequently bedridden, and had trouble walking without support. And through no fault of his own, he became a living monument to royal inbreeding. But here's the tragic irony: the Spanish court believed Charles's suffering was a test from God. So, they didn't look at his family tree and think, maybe we should mix in some new genes. No, they hired more priests. They prayed, fasted, and blamed sorcery for his infertility, because naturally, magic was more plausible than centuries of cousin weddings. His advisors even organized public exorcisms. One involved parading Charles through the streets, hoping divine intervention might make him less Habsburg. It didn't. Charles married twice, once to a French princess, and once to a German one. Neither union produced an heir. His health declined rapidly, and by his late 30s, he was a shell of a man who believed he was possessed by demons. He died in 1700, aged just 38, ending 2 centuries of Spanish Habsburg rule. When doctors performed an autopsy, they reportedly found his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs filled with water, and his intestines rotted and putrid. In other words, the poor man was a biological disaster from the inside out. Charles II's death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a polite European way of saying several nations fought over who got to inherit his mess. And that was the quiet end of one of Europe's most exclusive gene pools. Let's drift now from Spain northward, to Austria. Because the Austrian branch of the Habsburgs had been busy doing much the same thing, only with a little more pomp and slightly better portraits. The Austrian Habsburgs, keeping it in the family. In Vienna, the Habsburgs prided themselves on their refinement. They built elegant palaces, commissioned operas, and hosted masked balls where everyone was, genetically speaking, already related. By the 18th century, the Austrian line was still remarkably inbred. Their family gatherings were like mirror halls, everyone looked faintly similar, and no one could remember who was whose cousin. Yet despite the genetics, they were remarkably powerful. Maria Theresa, for instance, ruled as the only female monarch of the Habsburg dynasty. She was clever, devout, and determined, and she married her second cousin, because of course she did. Their children were a collection of Europe's most eligible inbred bachelors and bachelorettes. One of them, Marie Antoinette, would eventually lose her head in France, proving that the Habsburg talent for poor endings wasn't limited to health issues. But back to the Habsburgs themselves. By the 1800s, inbreeding was less fashionable, but still quietly practiced. Even Emperor Franz Joseph, who ruled for much of the 19th century, was married to his cousin Elizabeth, the famous Empress Sisi. She was beautiful, melancholy, and spent much of her life trying to escape the suffocating Viennese court, where depression was hereditary and conversation was mostly about etiquette. When their only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, took his own life at Mayerling in 1889, the dynasty's decline felt inevitable, a long, sad echo of what had begun centuries earlier with Charles II. By the time the Habsburg Empire collapsed in 1918, the family's genetic line and their empire had both grown too tangled to sustain. You might say history finally introduced them to the concept of natural selection. Let's drift west now, to France, land of perfume, pastries, and dynastic catastrophe. The Bourbons, France's beautiful mess. The Bourbon dynasty ruled France with style, elegance, and the occasional total lack of common sense. While not as famously inbred as the Habsburgs, they certainly had their share of cousinly affections. Their downfall wasn't so much genetic as it was behavioral. Too much power, too much luxury, and a chronic inability to notice when the peasants were starving. Take Louis XIV, the Sun King. He believed he was France, and to be fair, the Palace of Versailles was basically built to house his ego. Louis married his cousin, of course, because that was what respectable kings did. Then he had several mistresses, because that's what all kings did. He lived a long life, unusually long for someone in his family, and left behind an enormous number of descendants. Unfortunately, most of them married within the same small circle of nobility. By the 18th century, the Bourbon family tree looked suspiciously similar to the Habsburgs, just with better wigs. And into this illustrious line came Louis XVI, husband of the previously mentioned Marie Antoinette. He was earnest, shy, and more interested in locks and keys than politics. He and Marie Antoinette were distant cousins, not unusual for their class, and together they became the poster couple for royal obliviousness. While they lived in silk and gold, France starved. When revolution finally came, the monarchy found itself decapitated, quite literally. Marie Antoinette went to the guillotine in 1793, still insisting she hadn't meant to offend anyone. Her husband followed before her. Their deaths marked the end of the French monarchy as it had been known, though not the end of Bourbon attempts to regain the throne. But perhaps the most ironic part? After centuries of marrying their cousins to protect royal blood, it all ended with a pair of heads in a basket. Let's take a slow breath here. Inhale. Exhale. It's strange, isn't it? Generations of power, all undone by love, pride, and the occasional recessive gene. But we're not done drifting yet. Because over in England, and its many associated territories, the royal family was doing something very similar, and calling it tradition. Still awake? Or just pleasantly hovering somewhere between consciousness and a slow historical coma? Good. That's where we want to be. In this next stretch of our slow descent into dynastic absurdity, we're crossing the Channel, to Britain. Land of rain, tea, and genealogical confusion. The British royal family, or as they were known in earlier centuries, the house of everything they could marry within reach, spent a great deal of time and effort doing precisely what the Habsburgs did, marrying cousins, consolidating power, and producing generations of heirs who all looked vaguely like each other and faintly like a wax figure melting under mild heat. But the British variety came with a particular flair, a sort of genteel denial. While the Habsburgs leaned into their inbreeding like a medieval science project, the British managed to act as though nothing unusual was happening at all. They simply referred to it as keeping the blood royal. Which, of course, sounds much nobler than repeatedly marrying one's cousin named Charlotte. The Tudors, a short but dramatic genetic detour. Before we get to the heavyweights, the Hanoverians, the Windsors, and Queen Victoria's sprawling genetic empire, we should tiptoe briefly into the 16th century. The Tudors. They weren't actually around long enough to become truly inbred, but they certainly planted the seeds of royal dysfunction. Henry VIII, for example, a man who married 6 times, executed 2 of his wives, and created a religion simply so he could do it again. While not inbred himself, Henry did set the tone for royal reproductive anxiety. He desperately wanted a male heir. When his marriages produced only daughters and 1 sickly son, he blamed everyone but himself. In fairness, given what we know of his health, obesity, ulcers, probably diabetes, the miracle is that anyone survived his court at all. But his daughter Elizabeth I turned out to be one of England's greatest rulers, and famously refused to marry. Historians often debate whether that was political strategy or a shrewd refusal to further dilute an already questionable gene pool. The Stuarts, when things got weirdly familial. After Elizabeth died without an heir, the crown passed to her cousin, James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. He was, naturally, descended from both the English and Scottish branches of royalty. Because God forbid a monarchy pass the crown to someone not related by at least 2 different lines. The Stuart dynasty that followed was famous for a few things: divine right, civil wars, and a stubborn inability to produce stable heirs. James I's descendants included Charles I, who lost his head, and Charles II, who seemed determined to father children with everyone except his wife. He had at least a dozen illegitimate kids, possibly more, and not a single legitimate heir. His brother, James II, took over, married an Italian princess, and promptly lost the throne in the Glorious Revolution, largely because England didn't like Catholicism, or James, or really anyone with an accent at the time. By the time the Stuarts were done, England was once again in need of a monarch. And so, Parliament went shopping for one, in Germany. Because where else would you find a nice, Protestant cousin? The Hanoverians, cousins with crowns. In 1714, Britain imported George I, the Elector of Hanover. He barely spoke English, had an unpronounceable list of German relatives, and spent most of his reign missing Germany. But he was Protestant, and that was apparently good enough. George I's descendants, the Hanoverian kings, would rule Britain for the next 2 centuries. And they, too, had a favorite pastime, marrying within the extended family tree. George II married his cousin, Caroline of Ansbach, and to everyone's surprise, it was actually a functional marriage, though their descendants continued the trend with less success. By the time we reach George III, the famous Mad King, things get complicated. George III married Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, yet another German cousin. They had 15 children, because that's what one did before Netflix. George III was devoted to his wife, unusually for a monarch. He was also deeply pious, slightly paranoid, and later, mentally ill, likely from porphyria, a hereditary blood disorder. One could argue that centuries of marrying close relatives didn't help. His descendants would include George IV, who drank too much, William IV, who fathered 10 illegitimate children but none legitimate ones, and eventually Queen Victoria, who would turn cousin marriage into a global franchise. Queen Victoria, the genetic matriarch. Ah, Victoria. If history were a genetic soap opera, she'd be the central character. Born in 1819, Victoria was the granddaughter of George III and married her first cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. The two were deeply in love, which is lovely, and shared a remarkable ability to pass on recessive genes. Together, they had 9 children. And like all good royals, they treated marriage as diplomacy by bedroom. Their children were married off across Europe, Germany, Russia, Denmark, Spain. The result? By the early 20th century, Victoria's descendants sat on nearly every major throne in Europe. she was affectionately known as the grandmother of Europe. Though, given the genetic outcomes, the great genetic distributor might be more accurate. One of her genetic legacies was hemophilia, a bleeding disorder that ran through many of her descendants. Her son Leopold had it, and so did several of her grandchildren, spreading the condition through the royal houses of Spain, Germany, and Russia. Yes, that Russia. Because Victoria's granddaughter, Alex of Hesse, married Tsar Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia. Their son, Alexei, inherited hemophilia, which indirectly led to the rise of Rasputin, the mystic monk who promised to heal him. So, in a way, you could trace the fall of the Romanovs back to one well-meaning Victorian woman who married her cousin. It's a remarkable chain of cause and effect. And a gentle reminder that family reunions can, occasionally, alter the course of world history. The Windsors, rebranding the bloodline. By the 20th century, the British royal family had grown self-aware enough to notice that being German during World War I wasn't great for public relations. So, they rebranded. The family name changed from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor, named after Windsor Castle, which sounded much more British and much less like a Bavarian sausage brand. King George V and Queen Mary, who spearheaded the rebrand, were, naturally, cousins. Their children included Edward VIII, who abdicated the throne for love, and possibly fascism, and George VI, who stammered through speeches but won hearts during World War II. Even Queen Elizabeth II, the beloved monarch of modern Britain, married her third cousin, Prince Philip, both great-great-grandchildren of Queen Victoria. It was, by royal standards, almost distant. And their son, King Charles III, inherited not only the crown but the complex genetics of 10 centuries of selective cousinhood. Thankfully, by his generation, the royals had finally started to introduce new DNA. Princess Diana, for instance, was a descendant of the Spencer family, aristocratic, yes, but refreshingly non-Habsburg. So, perhaps, evolution had finally reached Buckingham Palace. A slow reflection on the royal gene pool. If you're still awake, you might be wondering, why did they do it? Why risk all the deformities, the madness, the hemophilia? Well, in their minds, blood was power. To marry outside the royal circle was to dilute divine legitimacy. And in a world where God supposedly chose kings, having pure royal blood meant being chosen twice. The irony, of course, is that the very purity they guarded eventually made them fragile, both biologically and politically. Empires crumbled not because of invasion, but because their rulers couldn't produce heirs who could stand upright or think clearly. By the modern era, even the royals had learned what commoners had known all along. That love and genetics are best kept at a reasonable distance. Let's take another slow breath. Imagine the candlelight flickering in some quiet palace corridor, portraits of distant cousins staring down, all faintly resembling one another. Somewhere in that long gallery, you might spot the ghost of a monarch whispering, "Perhaps, we should have diversified." And you can smile softly to yourself. Because yes, perhaps they should have. Still comfortable? Perfect. You've survived the Habsburgs and the Bourbons, the Tudors, and the Windsors. That alone makes you stronger than half of Europe's royal offspring. Now, we turn to the twilight of the Old World, when the great dynasties began to collapse under the weight of their own bloodlines. The 19th century was a strange era, modern enough for trains, but still medieval enough for royal matchmaking that felt like a genetic dare. Every royal marriage was arranged on a map, not in a chapel. And if two monarchs shared a great-grandparent, well, that was practically foreplay. At the center of this fading royal network stood three families. The Romanovs of Russia, the Habsburgs of Austria-Hungary, and the Hohenzollerns of Germany. And like the final acts of an overlong opera, they were all connected by one woman, Queen Victoria. The Romanovs, empire, snow, and hemophilia. Let's begin in Russia, a land of chandeliers, snowstorms, and political uprisings that always arrived right on schedule. At the turn of the 20th century, the Romanov dynasty had ruled for more than 300 years. The latest in the line was Tsar Nicholas II, a quiet, polite man who never wanted to rule an empire and proved it daily. Nicholas married Princess Alix of Hesse, granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Alix, or as she became known, Empress Alexandra, was deeply religious, anxious, and somewhat allergic to Russian politics. They were first cousins through Victoria's sprawling family network. Their marriage was a love match, which was rare and sweet. And also, genetically speaking, not the best idea. You see, Alexandra carried the hemophilia gene. And when their long-awaited son Alexei was born in 1904, it became clear that he had inherited it. For an empire built on divine right, a bleeding heir was not ideal PR. Hemophilia meant that even a small bruise could cause internal bleeding, and the boy's life became a constant vigil. Doctors couldn't cure him, no one could, until a wandering monk appeared, uninvited and unshaven, claiming he could. His name was Grigory Rasputin, and he entered the royal household like a strange dream that no one could wake from. He prayed over the boy, and miraculously, Alexei's bleeding stopped. Whether it was hypnosis, coincidence, or a rare moment of remission, the Tsarina took it as divine proof. Rasputin quickly became indispensable. He drank, bragged, seduced, and survived assassination attempts with what seemed like supernatural luck. Meanwhile, the Russian court descended into chaos. Nobles hated him. The people mocked the Tsar. And all the while, the boy's illness hung over everything, the quiet, bleeding symbol of a family line stretched too thin. When the revolution came in 1917, the Romanovs fell like dominoes. Nicholas abdicated. His family was imprisoned. And in 1918, they were executed in a basement in Ekaterinburg, a quiet, brutal end to centuries of divine right. It's tempting to think that history killed them, war, revolution, politics. But in truth, their downfall began much earlier, in the drawing rooms of Europe, when cousins married cousins and royal blood became too delicate to survive a paper cut. The Habsburg hangover, Austria-Hungary in decline. Meanwhile, over in Vienna, the Habsburgs were still at it, aging gracefully and reproducing unwisely. By the late 19th century, the empire was less a country and more a patchwork quilt of unhappy nationalities held together by etiquette and denial. At its head sat Emperor Franz Joseph, the last great Habsburg monarch. He had ruled since 1848, which, in European royal years, was practically forever. Franz Joseph was dutiful, polite, and possibly the most exhausted man in history. He married Elizabeth of Bavaria, better known as Sisi, a melancholy beauty who spent her life avoiding court life and writing sad poetry. She also happened to be his cousin, naturally. Their marriage produced tragedy after tragedy. Their son Rudolf died in a murder-suicide at Mayerling, their daughter Sophie died in childhood, and Sisi herself was assassinated by an Italian anarchist in 1898. Franz Joseph endured it all, stoically, because Habsburgs didn't emote, they just quietly developed ulcers. By the time his grandnephew Archduke Franz Ferdinand became heir, the empire was already cracking. And when that same Archduke was assassinated in Sarajevo in 1914, by a man named Gavrilo Princip, it set off World War I. It's remarkable, really. Centuries of careful genetic planning undone by one teenage nationalist with a pistol. If there's a moral, it's that you can inbreed an empire into fragility, but you can't control history. Franz Joseph died in 1916, before seeing his empire dissolve. His successor, Karl I, tried to hold it together, a sweet, well-meaning man who prayed for peace while everything disintegrated. By 1918, the Habsburg Empire was gone. Austria became a republic, and the royal family was politely exiled, their jawlines still impressively Habsburg to the very end. The Hohenzollerns, cousins at war. Meanwhile, in Germany, another of Queen Victoria's grandsons was making history in his own erratic way, Kaiser Wilhelm II. He was, technically, the cousin of both Tsar Nicholas II of Russia and King George V of Britain. Yes, the three great rulers of Europe during World War I were all related. They even looked eerily alike, same mustache, same nose, same faint sense of being the last people who should run anything. Wilhelm had been born with a withered arm, the result of a botched birth that may have caused lifelong nerve damage. It left him insecure, aggressive, and desperate to prove himself. He overcompensated with military uniforms and speeches about destiny, none of which made him more likable. During World War I, the cousins led their nations into carnage, sending millions to die, all while occasionally exchanging polite letters. Imagine a family reunion where everyone shows up with artillery. When the war ended, Wilhelm fled to the Netherlands, Nicholas was dead, and George V was left to reinvent monarchy as something quaint and ceremonial, a sort of national mascot rather than a divine ruler. It's hard not to see the cosmic irony. 3 branches of one family destroying each other's empires, while Queen Victoria's portraits still smiled down from their palaces. Royal decline is a gentle sleep story. If all of this sounds grim, that's because it was. But in the soft candlelight of hindsight, it's oddly peaceful. The 20th century quietly erased the old royal order. No more divine rights. No more cousin weddings, at least, not as many. Just constitutional monarchies smiling politely at parades. The empires that once demanded purity and perfection gave way to televised families waving from balconies, their power replaced by pageantry, and their genetic line, mercifully, diluted with normal DNA. Today's royals still carry those same surnames: Windsor, Habsburg, Romanov, at least in exile. But they're more human now, less divine, more relatable. Some even marry actors, which would have scandalized their ancestors almost as much as marrying outside the family once did. A slow drift through the ruins. Picture, if you will, the empty halls of the old palaces. The chandeliers unlit, the marble floors echoing with faint memories of court dances. You can almost hear the whispers, the slow hum of dynasties that believed they'd last forever. In Vienna, the Schönbrunn Palace sits quiet under pale morning light. In St. Petersburg, the Winter Palace still stands, painted a serene green, its rooms filled with museum visitors instead of nobles. And in London, the royals wave from balconies, descendants of all the cousins who started it all. History has a way of fading into calm. Empires collapse, bloodlines thin, portraits gather dust. But the stories remain, strange, tragic, gently absurd. A final reflection. So, what did we learn tonight? That power, when passed too carefully, becomes fragile. That families who marry themselves into corners often find history waiting there. And that in the end, every royal family is just another set of people, anxious, hopeful, and spectacularly short-sighted about genetics. The world they ruled is gone now, replaced by democracy, tabloids, and social media accounts where monarchs share photos of corgis. And maybe that's better. A little duller, perhaps. But much healthier. So as you drift off, imagine those old kings and queens fading gently into their portraits. The candles burn low, the corridors go quiet, and history itself exhales. Sleep well, dear listener. You survived Europe's most inbred dynasties. And unlike them, you're perfectly fine to wake up tomorrow,